Alright guys, you are here for the Unit 10 review, which is going to be to prepare you for your Unit 10 test on the Cold War and on World War II. So let's go ahead and get started. First, when we look at World War II, we have to consider what the initial stance of the United States was on the conflict itself, which is going to be our traditional foreign policy. The traditional foreign policy that we had was to remain neutral, to isolate. Remember, we're focusing on what's happening here in the United States, which is the Great Depression. So what the government does is pass the Neutrality Acts. Remember, the purpose of the Neutrality Acts was to avoid the mistakes that got us into World War I. That's where cash and carry comes into place. Remember, cash and carry is going to be if you have your own ships and you have the money on hand, then you can come and get the goods and you can take it with you. The United States is going to evolve to become more involved in the conflict, and that's when we declare ourselves the arsenal of democracy, where we are trying to supply the allies with as many weapons and supplies for the war as they can. And that's where the Lend-Lease Act comes in. Remember, we were giving away supplies to the Allies to fight against Germany in order for the war to not come to us. We want to avoid all of the causes that got us into World War I. The reason that we change from the Neutrality Acts, from this isolation into involvement, into the war, is Pearl Harbor. Remember, Pearl Harbor is going to put us in a position where we have now been attacked on our territory from Japan, and we declare war against Japan. Then we are officially in World War II. But our initial stance, neutral, then becomes involvement after Pearl Harbor. When we look at the home front during World War II, remember there was this big push for women to be in the workforce. The Rosie the Riveter campaign. Women should and can work in the war industries, those manufacturing jobs. Now that's going to change after World War II. Women are asked to give up those jobs when veterans come back, but during the war, women are encouraged to fill the positions of the men that were drafted away. When we look at public support for the war, how do we get the public to support the war here on the home front if they're not working in the factories or outside of that? We want to sell war bonds. Remember, this is how the government could collect money to supply the war and pay for all of those goods that we need. This is people purchasing war bonds, which are those IOUs from the government, raising money for the war. People could also ration, meaning they conserve the supplies here at home. They can grow their own victory garden. We had the rationing cards telling people how much of goods that they can buy. And rationing was really so that we can give what needs to be given to those who are fighting in the war. So we ration at home to have more supplies for the war. When we look at the role of African Americans in World War II, we see the military during World War II is segregated. But we have African Americans fighting in World War II for rights that they do not have here back at home. So post-World War II, we are going to see the civil rights movement push forward because of this idea that if we're going to fight for democracy abroad, then we should have full democracy here, and that's not what was happening. Rights of African Americans were severely restricted. We saw discrimination. We saw Jim Crow laws in the South. We had all of these racial practices in the South that African Americans after World War II are going to fight against in the civil rights movement. Also on the home front during World War II, we have the Japanese internment camps. The Japanese internment camps are an example of how the government limits civil rights during times of war. The Executive Order 9066 that is passed by FDR removes Japanese Americans from their homes, relocates them to the internment camps. Even though they had not committed a crime, they were just suspected of being spies. They are forced to move from their homes to these internment camps. Remember, we have precedent for the decision made in Korematsu versus U.S., where the Supreme Court gives the power to the United States government to limit the rights of people during wartime, and that precedent comes from Schenck versus U.S. The government is allowed to take away the rights of people during wartime if it means that we support or we're protecting the country, which the government upholds in Korematsu versus U.S. When we look at post-war decisions, one, we are going to see the United Nations was formed at the end of World War II. And the reason that the United Nations is formed is because we need a peacekeeping organization. The League of Nations after World War I fails because the United States was not involved. The League of Nations didn't have any force behind it. The United Nations corrects all of those mistakes. First, the United Nations includes everybody from every nation around the world. Second, the United Nations has the peacekeeping troops that can enforce any decisions that are made, and ultimately the United Nations proves to be successful. Also, after World War II, we are going to see the Nuremberg trials held. Remember, this is the war crimes trials for the Nazis and the leaders of the Third Reich in World War II. What we prove at Nuremberg is that individuals can be held accountable for the crimes that they commit during war. You no longer can say, well, I was ordered to do it. Nope, you now can be held accountable for your crimes. Yalta and Potsdam are the conferences that are held at the end of World War II. Yalta, we see FDR, Churchill, Stalin coming together to try to make decisions for what Germany will look like. Potsdam, we have Truman, we have Stalin, and we have Chamberlain. Again, the big three meeting just with different leaders, and again trying to make decisions on what the post-war world looks like. How do we handle Japan? How do we handle Germany? And how do we work together to make sure there isn't another world war? Cold War. First of all, the Cold War begins at the end of World War II, and the reason it begins is because the Soviet Union is trying to expand. The Soviet Union was trying to take countries that were war-torn by World War II, and the United States says, no, that is not okay, and we put in place the policy of containment. What we see is Truman is going to make a speech. When he makes this speech, it is called the Truman Doctrine. In this speech, he says, we are going to stop the spread of communism and protect Greece and Turkey. Remember, Truman is the doctor for Greece and Turkey. We are going to provide $400 million in aid, economic aid, military aid to Greece and Turkey to make sure that if they want to remain democratic, that they can. Once we see the success of Greece and Turkey not falling to communism, we are going to pass the Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Plan. And it does just that. It helps Europe recover from World War II and make sure that no communism spreads to other European countries. I told you that the Cold War was fought with proxy wars. One of the proxy wars that we see is the Korean War, where North Korea attacks South Korea. North Korea was the communist side of Korea. South Korea was meant to be backed by the United States, but once we leave, North Korea attacks and tries to take over the whole peninsula. Two big important pieces come out of the Korean War. First and foremost, we see that the United Nations is strong in the Korean War. The role of the United Nations sending in its peacekeeping forces and stopping the spread of communism and really just protecting anybody after a world war is the proof of the United Nations is better than the League of Nations, because in the Korean War, it's the first time we send out peacekeeping troops since the creation of the United Nations. Second big piece we want to remember about the Korean War is the role of General Douglas MacArthur. Remember, MacArthur is going to attempt to go against President Truman that told us we are not turning this war into a war on communism. We are just trying to protect South Korea. MacArthur is going to go to the House of Representatives and try to get them to go around the president and declare war on China. MacArthur gets fired for insubordination because he was a civilian trying to control the military, which is not allowed. We are also going to see the formation of NATO at the end of, or at the beginning of the Cold War. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is formed on the idea of mutual defense or collective security, meaning that we will come together and we will fight. If one of us is attacked, it is as if we are all attacked, and we will continue to fight and defend each other. The Warsaw Pact is the communist counterpart of NATO. Another important piece of the Cold War is the Berlin airlift. Remember, the United States sends in thousands of tons of supplies to Berlin after the Soviets blockaded Berlin. The reason we are helping Berlin is because we don't want West Berlin to fall to communism, and it shows the United States will go to any length necessary to follow up this policy of containment. Whether it's a half a city or it's a whole country, we will make sure that no one who doesn't want communism has to fall to communism. Cold War at home. You want to remember the term McCarthyism. Remember, that is that idea that if McCarthy pinpointed you as a communist, then you could be blacklisted from your career. It's that fear of the spread of communism, this belief that McCarthy knew all. The McCarthy hearings are going to bring the spotlight to the potential threat of communists in our government who may be trying to tear down our democracy. McCarthy's fall is going to be when he tries to point to people within the military. He even goes so far to accuse the Secretary of State, John Marshall, that created the Marshall Plan, a policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. McCarthy ultimately will end with the military hearings, but McCarthyism, that belief that McCarthy knew all of the communists in the government. HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, that was the House of Representatives committee that was searching for communists within the government. They held the hearings that was supposed to find communists within not only our government, but just our society. The most infamous hearings being that of the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 being the group of 10 filmmakers, writers, producers, directors that refuse to give up any names. And finally, what we call this time period during the Cold War in the U.S. home front is the Red Scare. Remember, this is the second Red Scare, where we were fearful that communists were going to take over our government and destroy the democracy of the United States. That brings us to the end of our review video. That should help you out completing your Cold War, World War II review guide. If you have any questions, please come and see me. Good luck.